Okay guys, today we're going to add to our proofs. We're going to talk about midpoints, bisectors, and trisectors, and those are going to be things that you're able to include in your reasons column when you're doing a proof. So let's start with a little review. Remember our definition of a midpoint. If a point is a midpoint, then it divides the segment into two congruent parts. The key word there, remember, is divides. If a point is a midpoint, so that's going to be in your given, then it divides a segment into two congruent parts. So when you use this reason, in your statement you need to say something about having which two parts are congruent. A reminder that definitions are also reversible, so we can switch it around. If a point divides a segment into two congruent parts, then it is the midpoint of that segment. Okay, so let's take a look what this would look like in a proof. You're going to start with your given, just like always. In this one, segment CM bisects segment AB. And your reason is given. Okay, now think about what we know about bisects, our definition of that. So if we start with CM bisects AB, remember when we used to highlight the part that's being bisected? So AB is highlighted here. So that's the part we know something about. We don't know anything about MC. What we can say is because it is bisected, it's divided in half. So now we know actually what we're trying to prove, that AD is congruent to DB. We're ready to say that right away in step 2. Segment AD is congruent to segment DB. And here's where we have to be careful. We're going to start with if a segment bisects a segment. That's what we have here in the given. Something bisects something else. Something bisects something else. So that's in general in the reasons area. If a segment bisects a segment, then, key word, it divides it into two congruent parts. Okay, now that one was a little bit different than our definition of midpoint, but that's because in the given, we weren't given midpoint, we were given the word bisects. So it's important to use whatever you were given, that same terminology, bisects, when you say your reason. Now the next problem, it's a little bit different. The next one, we are told that GA is congruent to AM, so we can start by marking our picture. We'll start with our given in our proof. GA is congruent to AM. Step 1, given. Don't forget to number your steps. And now they're asking us to prove that A is the midpoint. Think about it. Do we know that? Is A dividing GM into two congruent parts? If it is, then A is the midpoint. Okay, so because that's our definition that we set up here, if a point divides a segment into two congruent parts, then it is the midpoint of the segment. We're ready to go ahead and say what we're trying to prove. So step 2, we can go ahead and say A is the midpoint of segment GM. And our reason is going to be if a point divides a segment into two congruent parts, then it is the midpoint. So for this one, you really have to think about what you were given. You were given two congruent parts. So in our if part, we should be saying two congruent parts. The then part, remember, is what you're trying to prove. So we're trying to prove that it's a midpoint. Then it is the midpoint. Okay, that's always a good thing to double check when you're doing your proofs. The previous statement should be in the if part of the statement. the what you're trying to prove should be in the then part of the statement, just a reminder. Okay, the next one we just have to find the mistake. So this one says given A is the midpoint of segment CT. So I'm going to start by highlighting segment CT. A is the midpoint, means it's in the middle, so I have two congruent parts, CA and AT. So far if I'm looking at what I'm trying to prove, everything looks good. A really is the midpoint of CT, so CA is congruent to AT. Now let's look at what they say in the proof. They start with their given. A is the midpoint of CT, step 1 given. Step 2, they're saying what they're trying to prove, so the mistake must be happening somewhere in this reason. Let's see what they say. If a point divides a segment into two congruent segments, then it is the midpoint of that segment. Okay, take a look. Remember, in the if part, we should be looking at what we've already said. So I should be saying if a midpoint. Do you guys see that in the if part? I don't see midpoint in the if part. I am seeing midpoint in the then part of the statement. So that's telling me that this reason is going to be backwards. We need to reverse it. We should be starting with if a point is a midpoint, then what does a midpoint do? Then it divides the segment into two congruent parts. Okay, so watch out for that. This is a really good skill, is trying to look at a proof that's already been done, see if you can find the mistake. Midpoint should be in the if, congruent segment should be in the then. So here, when I corrected it, two congruent parts is now in the then part of the statement. Alright, let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about angles. Before we start looking at proofs, let's remember our definitions. So, angle bisector, if a ray bisects an angle, then it divides the angle, there's that D word again, into two congruent angles. If we reverse it, if a ray divides an angle into two congruent angles, then it bisects the angle. Also remember our definition of an angle trisector. So officially in your if-then, notice that all of these were already putting in if-then format for you, so you're ready to use them right away in your proof. If two rays trisect an angle, then they divide the angle into three congruent angles. Not two, trisector means three. And then the reverse would be if two rays divide an angle into three congruent angles, then they trisect the angle. Okay, so let's go ahead and try using the bisecting and trisecting words in our proof. Okay, the first one, we'll start with our given again. Ray PS bisects angle RPO. Step 1, given. Okay, now I do want to make sure that I'm marking my picture correctly, so I'm going to highlight angle RPO. Here it is, and I'm going to highlight ray PS. Okay, and then once I have that, it should be pretty obvious which angles we're talking about. The only ones I have highlighted in green are these two, angle RPS and angle OPS. And those are the two that we were supposed to prove congruent. So we are now ready in step 2 to say angle RPS is congruent to angle OPS, because if a ray bisects an angle, that's the part that I was given. That's the part that I've already said in my proof. So that's the part that goes in my if statement. That's how I know where to put it. If it's in a previous step, it can go in the if. So if a ray bisects an angle, then what does it do? It divides it into two congruent angles. Okay, so when you get stuck thinking about what does it do, that's when you have to think about that key D word, divides. It divides it into two congruent angles. Okay, let's try a couple more proofs involving angles. So here's the one again. We're going to start with the given. angle EAB is congruent to angle BAC, which is congruent to angle CAD. So 3 congruent angles this time. If I go ahead and mark my picture, that's these 3 up here. Lines are a little bit off, that's okay. And then for my reason, I can say what I'm trying to prove in the next step. Ray AB and ray AC trisect angle EAD. So I'm ready to go ahead and say that for step 2. Ray AB and ray AC trisect angle EAD. And I'm going to start with, in my if statement, what did we have in the given? In general, those are 3 congruent angles. So in my if statement, I should be talking about if 2 rays divide an angle into 3 congruent angles, then they trisect the angle. Okay, so if 2 rays divide an angle into 3 congruent angles, this one's a little bit tricky because it seems like in our previous step we didn't say anything about 2 rays dividing an angle. But you have to think about, how did we get to 3 congruent angles? We got 3 congruent angles because these 2 rays were dividing up this big one. So a little bit tricky. That's definitely one to be studying and looking at. We can do the same thing with bisect. If I have 2 congruent angles, you would start with if 1 ray bisects an angle, then it divides it into 2 congruent angles, then it bisects the angle. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. The next one, we just have to find the mistake. Okay, this one says ray AB and ray AC trisect angle PAT. So if we mark our picture, we would say these are the 3 congruent angles. And what we're trying to prove is exactly that. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, which is congruent to angle 3. So they're starting their proof correctly with the given. Then they're saying what they're trying to prove on the statement. Their reason must be what's wrong. So let's take a look. If 2 rays divide an angle into 3 congruent angles, then they trisect the angle. That's a correct statement, but look at the order. What should we be starting with in the if statement? If 2 rays not divide, but in the given we were told that they trisect the angle. Okay, so this one is backwards again. In this one we should be starting with if 2 rays trisect an angle, then they divide the angle into 3 congruent angles. That way we end up with what we're trying to prove, 3 congruent angles in the then part of the statement. Okay, we've got one more where we have to find the mistake. This one starts with given angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and we're trying to prove that ray DB bisects angle ADC. So we start with the given, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Then they're saying what they're trying to prove. Ray DB bisects angle ADC. So far so good. Take a look at their reason. If a ray divides a segment into 2 congruent segments, then it bisects the segment. Well, if we just look at the ending, then it bisects the segment, that would be true. Then it bisects. But look more closely at this problem. Look at what word they're saying in their reasons. Are we talking about segments in this problem? Or are we talking about angles in this problem? Go back to your given information. In this problem, we're talking about angles. In the reason, they're talking about segments. So this is just a little fix. If a ray divides an angle into 2 congruent angles, then it bisects the angle. Just a common thing, we talked about this the other day, but make sure you're talking about the right thing in your problem. If you're given angles in the problem, you should be talking about angles in your reason. If you're given segments in the problem, then you should be talking about segments in your reason. All right, go ahead and start your homework. You have book work for homework tonight. On Monday, we will start talking about different types of logic, and we'll go over your homework pretty well on Monday. Feel free to ask questions. If you have any, you can always email me. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.